Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 2 of Blurred Laws and Life with me, your host, Richard Busch. Today is April 4, 2020, and it was another rough week in this coronavirus hell we are all living through, particularly in New York. And from what I hear, the news out of New York is not promising for next week. So please, everyone, keep them in your hearts and thoughts and mind because it's not great right now. I have a lot of friends, colleagues, and clients in New York, so I'm obviously in communication with them, talking to them, and they all have a very positive attitude, and they will get through it, and we will all get through this and come out of the other side before we know it. On the subject of trying our best to look on the bright side and see any positive that can come out of this coronavirus, and it's very hard to see that when you see reports of literally thousands of people dying each day. But in the practice of law, at least in the entertainment field, you end up running up against the same lawyers over and over again. At least I have over the course of the last 20 years. And one of two things generally happens when you litigate against someone in really tough and emotional cases. You either end up despising them, truly, or you end up gaining a healthy respect for your opponents. But regardless, it's usually a very adversarial relationship, to say the least. I have received several emails and phone calls over the past month from lawyers who I have been fighting against for 20 years, checking up on me, wanting to see how I was. I've reached out to others I have known and generally been up against to see how they are. And again, this is not meant to be a philosophical show, but you realize what is important in life. In many ways, this has served, at least I hope, to bring everyone closer together and realize we're all in it together. And to be honest, some of the phone calls and emails I've received from adversaries are people that I have not had any personal relationship with. It's all been professional. It's all been adversarial. I don't know that we've ever said many nice things to each other over the last 20 years, but all of a sudden, I've had people check up on me, and I've checked up on others. So that has been nice. I am sure that when this is all over, it won't be long until we go back to fighting tooth and nail and being at each other's throats. But it has been a silver lining, if you want to call it that has emerged from this crisis, I think, is the idea that we are all in this together. Now, I'm sure all of you who listened to episode 1 last week heard that great music that we have been playing and will play in this episode and future episodes. And shout out to freeplaymusic.com, where we licensed that music per the terms of use on their website, where there are literally about 50,000 tracks available for license. That's right, we licensed all of the music. I'm not going to get accused of copyright infringement. I'm not that stupid. Don't you know there are all kinds of people out there just waiting for me to play unlicensed music and say, "Oh, Richard Busch, copyright infringer." You'll have to try and get me for something else because you're not going to get me for that. Last week, I also credited the late, great Jackie Gleason when I said, away we go. And I think I owe a further credit to the also great Billy on the Street. You know, one of the, I don't want to call it a benefit, but one of the, I'll say, side effects or collateral damage from being quarantined is we have nothing much to do but watch TV and discover shows we've never seen before. And one such show that I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that I have discovered, is the show Billy on the Street, which I never saw before or heard of before, but I found it on Netflix, and it is quite enjoyable, very funny. And before Billy plays different games with his guests, random guests that he finds on the street, he also says, away we go. Now, Billy doesn't credit Jackie Gleason, but I did, and I will also give a further shout out to the also great Billy on the Street. I usually don't like legal shows because it stresses me out, because my life is obviously the law, and so it strikes too close to home. But another show that I discovered in my quarantine has been The Night Of. It was an HBO series, had one season, and it involves a person accused of murder and his subsequent trial. And the reason I mention it is because it has the most ridiculous set of circumstances one can imagine. It was a good show. But in the show, the defendant who is accused of murder refuses a recommended plea agreement that his kind of shady lawyer obtained because she just wanted a quick plea. And when he refused it, and she was at a law firm, when he refused it, she said she was going to withdraw from the case. But instead of the law firm withdrawing from the case, she allowed her first-year associate, who had never tried a case, to take over with zero supervision from anyone in the law firm, which obviously is preposterous. Can you imagine the malpractice lawsuit that would be filed if this defendant got convicted of first-degree murder and the law firm allowed a first-year associate to try the case with no supervision and with the partner on the case refusing to participate? Absolutely absurd, but if you can suspend that disbelief for a moment, it was actually a pretty good show. One other ironic side note from The Night Of, another lead actor in that show is John Turturro, and in it he plays another lawyer who has, for some reason, I don't know why they thought this was a good subplot to have, a horrible case of eczema on his foot. His foot is absolutely disgusting throughout the show. And the reason why I thought that was ironic is because one of my favorite Adam Sandler movies, yes, I do enjoy Adam Sandler movies, is Mr. Deeds. And John Turturro plays Mr. Deeds' butler, and he has a foot fetish. So it's ironic that in The Night Of, John Turturro has the most disgusting foot you can imagine, while in Mr. Deeds, he plays a butler with a foot fetish. Check them both out, and you'll see what I mean. Now, on this week's episode of Blurred Laws in Life, I'm going to have a really special guest who is a client and a very good friend, Joel Martin. Joel, along with the Bass brothers, Mark and Jeff Bass, are the people who discovered Eminem when he was in high school. And Joel will have a lot of different stories to tell about that. And then Joel and the Bass brothers company, FBT Productions, ended up bringing and winning a landmark case in which I represented them that established how artists should be paid on download royalties and revenue. It was a landmark case at the time. It spawned many other lawsuits where I represented different plaintiffs, and also spawned actual class actions against the music industry. We'll be talking about that case. I'll be explaining it, and we'll be talking about how digital royalties are payable to artists, and the fight that we had to go through to make sure that artists were paid appropriately. So a bit of background on this. In record contracts, historically, artists are paid one of two ways. If a record label sells a record, think of a traditional CD or album, the artist gets paid a relatively low royalty based upon a percentage of what's called the constructed retail price of that album. Could be 8%, could be 10%. It depends on the artist's success and the terms they can negotiate. But generally speaking, it's a relatively low, historically, royalty. And why is that? Because with each sale of a traditional record, when there were things like CDs and albums, the record label has incremental costs with each unit, meaning that for every CD, they have the cost of the case, they have the cost of the liner notes, they have the loss of manufacturing the disc, they have distribution costs, etc. And so the artist gets paid a relatively low royalty on each album sale. Now, on the other hand, in most record contracts, historically, there was what was called a license provision. When a record label licensed, historically, the master recording, the sound recording to a third party for either distribution by that third party at their own cost, or for a TV show, or for inclusion in a movie, the record label will pay the artist 50% of their net receipts from the licensing of that recording. And why is that? Because when a record label historically licensed a recording to a third party, they have no cost. They simply send over a digital file of that recording to the third party. Think about, a compilation album or for a TV show or movie, and the third party then does all the work. It's only fair that the artist would receive, 50% of those, of whatever the record label gets, because the record label has no cost. So let's say KTEL, which was a compilation album company, wanted to do best, rap songs. And they would reach out to Universal and say, we want to put one of Eminem's songs, Cleaning Out My Closet, or Stan, or whatever it might be, on this compilation album. And Universal would say, sure. And they'd work out the terms of the license. They would send over a digital file of that track to KTEL. KTEL would then do all the work. They would have all the costs of distribution. They'd have all the costs of manufacturing. And they would release the album. And Universal would, have no costs for that. So historically, as I said, when there was a license of a recording like that, or for a TV show or for a movie, artists would get, under what's called the licensing provision of the recording agreement, 50% of the label's net receipts. Now, that was very easy to deal with under those circumstances until permanent downloads came along. And when permanent downloads came along, the record industry realized that the days of physical sales were probably going to come to an end. I don't think they envisioned at that time that streaming and interactive streaming would become the dominant form of distributing music, but permanent downloads became initially the great challenge for record labels. And why is that? Because if permanent downloads were considered to be licenses under the license clause of a record contract, then instead of having to pay artists a very low royalty based on a percentage of a constructed retail price of an album, and had to pay 50% of the net receipts that they received from iTunes and other download companies, it would cost them literally billions of dollars. So what happened? Well, every record label took the position that these were not licenses from them to iTunes, but rather they were selling the tracks to iTunes, just like they did to Best Buy or Tower, back when there was a Tower Records, just like they did with physical albums, and that iTunes was reselling to the consumer, and that therefore the sales provision of the artist contract governed and not the licensing provision. I believe they all agreed, and the reason being that if one of them took the position that it was a license, that would have meant that none of them could take the position that these were sales. Now, mind you, the record labels were actually selling iTunes nothing. They were not selling the tracks to iTunes. They were simply licensing them. And how do we know that? Because none other than Steve Jobs penned an essay that was on Apple's website at the time entitled Thoughts on Music. And in it, he said multiple times that iTunes purchases nothing from the record labels. They don't sell anything to iTunes, but rather iTunes licenses the recordings from the record labels, create the download, and then sell to the public. So Steve Jobs himself contradicted the position of the record labels. Also, when this happened, there was a letter that was written by 27, I believe, of the top entertainment lawyers in the country to the record labels, saying that downloads were in fact licenses from the record labels to iTunes, and that the artist should be paid under the licensing provisions of the record contracts. But the record labels held firm. They rejected that, and their position was that it's the same product, that, when you go onto iTunes, you buy the same album that you could buy at a record store, like a physical record store, like Best Buy or Tower. There was no difference in the product. It's their product, and that it was simply a different form of distribution, but it was still a sale, and that therefore the sale provision of the record contract should govern. So I guess to boil it down a little bit more, their focus, the record label's focus, was on the end user transaction, that is, from iTunes to the consumer, and then that was a sale. And they were not focused, conveniently, on the transaction between the record label themselves and iTunes, which was the actually relevant transaction. And their position was, since the end user owns the download, that it is a sale transaction, and therefore the sales provision of the artist recording agreement governed. They also drew a distinction between that transaction and a streaming transaction where the end user doesn't own the stream, And they did agree to pay 50% of net receipts on revenue from streaming. Now, I firmly believe they had no idea that Spotify would emerge 10 years later, or that interactive streaming would become the force that it's become and basically made permanent downloads, dinosaurs themselves. But at the time, that was the focus, permanent downloads. And their focus in making their argument to artists and artist lawyers was that because the end user owned the download and it was the same product that you could buy at a record store, that the licensing provision did not apply, and that the licensing provision was never intended to govern these types of transactions. The guys who discovered Eminem and produced and co-wrote many of Eminem's earliest songs and hits disagreed. They, through an agreement with Interscope, initially Aftermath Records and ultimately Interscope Records, still received a significant portion of royalties from recordings made by Eminem and had the rights to those royalties and other rights through an agreement with Interscope Records. And they made the argument that the relevant transaction was the agreement between Universal, Interscope Records, and iTunes. And it did not matter what the end user transaction was labeled. And that is because in the licensing provision of the Eminem recording agreement with Aftermath Records, which later became owned by Interscope, it said something like, on masters licensed by us to others for the manufacture and distribution of records or for any other use, you will receive 50% of our net receipts. So it's the masters licensed by us to others. That's the relevant transaction, they argued, based on the specific language of the agreement. And that was very similar language that was found historically in all record contracts. Our argument in response to the label's argument that this is their product, that this is the same product that you would buy, the same album you would buy if you went to Best Buy or Tower Records to buy an album, was that there's no additional cost to the record label. In other words, for each physical sale of a physical unit, as I spoke about earlier, the record label has incremental costs with each unit sale. Downloads are different. They take a digital file of the album, of each song. They send it over to iTunes. You can download the individual song in the album. You can download the entire album, but there is zero additional cost to the record label if that song, that track, or that album is then downloaded one time or a billion times. It's all profit to the record label. And that was our response. And it's a fact, it's true, that there is no additional cost to the record label, no matter how many times the end user downloads. Again, to us, that was not relevant. To us, the argument was that it's black and white. The agreement between the label and iTunes is the relevant agreement. It's a license, and it's black and white that the license provision in the recording agreement entitled Eminem and FBT to 50% of net receipts for all license revenue. So as I mentioned on the first episode of Blurred Laws in Life, I was referred to Joel and to the Bass Brothers by my client in Detroit, Armin Baladian from Bridgeport Music and Westbound Records. And he recommended that Joel use me for this case. So I met with Joel, and he liked me, and he ended up hiring me. We ended up filing the first lawsuit challenging the way in which Eminem and FBT were paid on these permanent downloads. We understood that it was a significant case and that it could affect the entire record industry and every other artist out there. No one else was willing to file that first lawsuit. No one else was willing to challenge the way the record labels were paying artists, maybe out of fear of retribution, maybe out of fear of taking on these massive companies. But Joel and the Bass brothers were not. They had the courage to do it, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. So we ended up filing the case. It was a really interesting case. It was a war. It was a literal war. They fought us every step of the way. A lot of interesting things came out of that. I actually got to depose Steve Jobs in Cupertino at Apple headquarters over his thoughts on Music Essay that I mentioned earlier. That deposition was videotaped, and it was not soon after that, I should say, that Apple announced that he was very sick. But I have that videotape deposition. It is under protective order. I can't discuss it. But if I ever decide that I don't want to practice law and want to escape to a country without extradition, I could always sell it to TMZ or something, but don't think I'm going to do that. So I can't discuss that deposition. I wish I could. But the case was, as I mentioned, a real war. And in fact, the lawyers for Universal in that case, very good lawyers, they made all the different arguments that I mentioned to the jury. We actually filed before the trial a motion for summary judgment asking the court to rule as a matter of law that the agreement between Universal and iTunes was a license agreement, was not a sale agreement under the law, and that the plain language of the record contract required that Eminem and FBT be paid 50% of the label's net receipts. The court denied that motion. So we went to trial, and, this is probably a topic for another show, but in a trial, jury selection and who's on your jury can make all the difference. Just like whatever judge you get can make all the difference between winning and losing. And during the jury selection, obviously we took the position that the court should have ruled on as a matter of law that we were right. But the court denied that, as I mentioned, and sent the case to the jury. During jury selection, and I'll talk to Joel about this a little more when we speak, but there was actually a Catholic priest that was on the jury pool. And I told Joel at the time, please, let's get him off of the jury. Let's strike him, because Eminem at the time was very controversial. He had lyrics. He had, a lot of obviously 4-letter words in his songs. He took controversial positions on a lot of different topics. And I was concerned that, the priest simply would not like, Eminem, and would therefore be against us. But Joel felt that the language was so clear, and that he would, he was educated and would therefore be able to read, the plain language of both the iTunes agreement and the recording agreement, and would be able to follow the jury instructions of the court and would rule for us. Ultimately, at the trial, the defense lawyers made the very same arguments I mentioned before, that the end user transaction is a sale, that it's the same product you would buy at a record store, there was no difference, and that there was no reason that artists should be getting 50% of net receipts. And the jury actually ruled in favor of the defendants. And we actually polled the jury after the trial and asked them how they could possibly have found that way. And the jurors basically said that the Catholic priest was against Eminem, and he governed the jury room, and they just listened to what he had to say. And so I've been holding that over Joel's head ever since. Luckily and fortunately, I don't think it's luck, but it actually all worked out perfectly, because we then appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in our favor. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled as a matter of law that the iTunes Universal Agreement was a license agreement, that the relevant transaction was the transaction between the record label and iTunes, that it did not matter whether the end transaction between iTunes and the consumer was a sale or not, because that's not the relevant transaction in the recording agreement, and that the relevant transaction in the recording agreement, by its plain language, is the transaction between the record label and iTunes. And that in the Eminem FBT Aftermath recording agreement, the license provision required the record label to pay 50% of net receipts on all license transactions, which this one was, and not only reversed the jury verdict, but entered judgment in our favor. And as I mentioned earlier, that victory then spawned many, many cases by artists saying "Me Too." And I guess that was the original hashtag "Me Too." And I handled many of those cases myself. And there were actually several class actions filed against record labels for underpayment of digital royalties. So that was an incredibly satisfying and great victory for not just FBT, and not just for Joel and Mark and Jeff, but for artists throughout the country at the time. Got them paid correctly and rightfully, and I feel very proud of having won that case for not just my clients, but for everyone else. And a little side note, one of the great legendary artists that I represented in a similar lawsuit was James Taylor, one of the greatest songwriters and artists of all time. And just to tell you what a incredible person James Taylor is, well, let me back up and say this. It's not lost on me, from where I come from, how surreal it is to be able to get to know and represent some of the most legendary and famous entertainers, artists, performers, songwriters of all time. It is mind-blowing. I never take it for granted. And when I represented James in a similar lawsuit to the FBT case, I went to, I was invited to his home to prepare when he was going to be deposed for his deposition. And I was at his home, sitting at his kitchen table, and I'm thinking, I'm sitting at James Taylor's kitchen table preparing him for a deposition. It was and is a surreal moment for me, and as I said, something that things like that I never take for granted. And just to tell you another story, and that is just to show you what an incredible, caring person he is. I think it was sometime after we finished that case, but I was almost killed in a bike accident. I was riding my bike in Nashville, Tennessee. I stupidly had on, I was listening to music while I was riding, wasn't paying attention, came up to an intersection and was going really fast, and thought I had a green light. I had looked down to pedal through it. Light turned red. The cars started coming out from where they were, from the other side of the road, and I went full speed into the front of a car that pulled out in front of me, and flew headfirst over the hood of the car, landed on my head on the other side, and was, knocked unconscious, and I was out, and woke up at the emergency room, and doctor told me that I was lucky to be alive, and it was a miracle I wasn't like paralyzed from the neck down. But I did walk out of there, and I was okay. After I got out, I received a personal handwritten letter from James Taylor and his wife Kim, just saying, how worried they were about me, that they heard what happened, and they sent me a few gag gifts, but a handwritten letter from James Taylor was he sent me, and that I'll keep it forever. And what a wonderful person he is. I have now with me Joel Martin. Joel, how are you?
Good, considering.
I know. How are you surviving the COVID in Detroit? What's it like there?
The routine is upside down, and we're in our house, my wife, my two kids, and we've been hunkered down here for about 2.5 weeks. Yeah, not really going anywhere. I managed to go shopping a couple of days ago, but it's definitely not business as usual, Richard.
Let me ask you this question, Joel. You're from Detroit, right?
Yep.
In the movie 8 Mile, when Eminem says in the last rap battle scene, everyone in the 313, raise your MF hands in the air or something like that?
Yeah.
Did that make you mad because you have a 248 area code and therefore you could not raise your hands in the air?
Well, I came from Detroit when it was the 313 in the suburbs. Okay, so Detroit at some point was always 313, at least for me growing up. So, yeah, 248, 313, I think it doesn't make much of a difference. Everybody seems to have a cell phone that says 313, but they're actually in the suburbs and vice versa. So, no, I wasn't bothered by it.
Well, you say that, but I think Eminem's entire point was that Clarence, who was his enemy, could not raise his hands in the air because he was from the suburbs. And now I think you are pretty much comparing yourself to Clarence, who was from the suburbs. And I'm just wondering if that kind of affects your credibility.
Hey, you know what? I'm going to own it at this point. I am from the suburbs. I definitely live north of 8 Mile by about a mile. So that makes me a suburbanite. My original studio that I worked at with the Bass Brothers was on 8 Mile. And so I considered that, of course, Detroit. It was, I think, legitimate enough that we were on 8 Mile. As a matter of fact, 8 Mile was our moniker. 8 Mile Style was a production company and publishing company that we started way back when. And that was the whole point. We were on 8 Mile, and it really at that point didn't matter which side of 8 Mile you were from. But if you were on 8 Mile, it was the real thing. So even though I'm on 9 Mile, that's where our studios are now, I can claim that we were the original 8 Mile Style guys.
Okay, I'm just not sure about your credibility on this 8 Mile thing and the 248 versus 313, but I think we should move on. But I'm questioning the credibility. That's all I'm saying. So Joel, all jokes, all jokes aside, you have been in the music business pretty much your entire life, right? Your entire career. We'll get to how you and the Bass Brothers, first met Eminem and in a moment. But why don't you just tell everyone about kind of your background, and because I think you've pretty much done it all. I'd like to let people know, the things you did before Eminem.
Yeah, well, I went to school in a town called Oak Park, Michigan. I was born in Detroit, but at some point moved to, I again, just north of 8 Mile Road, and went to school with some other well-known music guys that came out of the city, including Don Was and Doug Feiger. There were a lot of pretty well-known music alumni that, for some reason or other, seemed to have graduated or went to Oak Park High School. At that time, we're talking about 1973, 1974. So I grew up in the suburbs. Yes, I did, but it was a melting pot in my school at Oak Park High School of cultures. You know, we had rockers, you had soul guys, R&B guys, guys that were into Hendrix, certainly the guys that were into Funkadelic, and the people, generally speaking, were listening to everything back then. It wasn't so segregated, so to speak. It was, you could be doing anything musically, and you certainly weren't ostracized for it. So I had a lot of experiences in the urban music community when I started working as an intern at a recording studio in Detroit called Artie Fields, and it happened to be the studio that Funkadelic was recording at. I got a job there as an intern as part of a work-study program from my high school. So I'd leave high school at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when I was 16 and went down to this recording studio where, they were doing a lot of commercials back then at the studio, but it was also the studio that Westbound Records used for their groups, including Funkadelic and Ohio Players, and a lot of the Motown groups had also recorded there. They were overflows from the Motown Studio A, and so I had a lot of experience by the time I was 18 at this particular recording studio with a variety of different groups and styles. But back in 1975, for me to meet George Clinton was an extraordinary thing. I'd known all about George since I had bought the Parliament's first record, I Want to Testify, in 1967 when I was 10 years old. I actually went out to a music store called Mumford Music. I bought that first single I've ever bought, because I used to hear that song, I Just Want to Testify What Your Love Has Done for Me, on CKL Radio, CKLW Radio. And it, to me, was the best song I'd ever heard. So that was my initiation into buying records. And in 1975, I eventually got to meet George by working in that recording studio that he was at that time recording in.
And you, through the years, up through Eminem, you've worked with George Clinton. You've worked with, I believe you worked with and managed the Romantics and many others, right?
Yeah. I got into producing when I was 18, 19 years old, and was inspired in part by the producers as opposed to the musicians that were working with many different groups and not just one group at the time. You'd have one or two producers working with 7 or 8 groups, and that seemed very appealing to me as opposed to working with one group in particular. So, I think at an early age I realized that you probably had to diversify a bit if you were going to stay in the business as a producer or engineer, that, wasn't a safe bet to just work with one group and put your eggs in that basket.
And when did you meet? And well, let me ask this question: when did you get your own studio?
I think I want to say it was 1984. I opened 54 Sound. I want to say it was the summer of 84. Going into 85. And I remember, I think the first, and by the way, at that time, George was kind of out of his record deals with the various labels. Maybe he was still with Capitol. But at the time, I'd connected with George. We had produced a group together called Aramis Hall back in the early 80s. And I'd had a relationship with him then as a record producer and an engineer. And at some point, because most of the money that a lot of these budgets were going to was for the recording studio, the idea was to be able to open our own studio. And until then, I'd been booking and renting other studios, to open our own studio and actually take some of the money out of the budget that would go for the recording fund. So with George as my co-partner and or client, we opened the studio and basically did an awful lot of recording up until 1990 at least through Westbound, their projects, Paisley Park, some of the Capitol projects, and it was the first time I think that George was probably taking some of that budget and actually putting it in his own pocket as opposed to having to pay all the studios. So yeah, we decided to go into business, so to speak, and I want to say it was 1985. And our first client, my first client, was George producing the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He actually ended up doing the record down at United Sound, but my studio was opened in time so that they could do all the pre-production and rehearsals. And I think that was my first client with George, the Chili Peppers, in 85.
And when did you meet your now partners, Mark and Jeff Bass, the Bass brothers? When did you first meet them?
I want to say I met Mark in 1975. I was, again, 18 years old, and he was 8 years old. So I was Mark Bass's counselor at a camp in Michigan called Camp Tamarack. I was 18. I managed to somehow take the summer off, and before I went to college, I was able to work as a counselor, and he was one of my campers. He was an 8-year-old precocious kid that played drums, and of course I had the musical background, and I organized the talent show that they had every season, and he was, or at least I think every session, there were campers that put on a talent show, and he was very talented, very focused, and kind of a pistol. And so I knew him when he was 8 years old, and I organized that talent show that he was a drummer in, along with 4 or 5 other campers. And so that's how I met Mark. Now, Mark's brother, Jeff, had gone to Oak Park High School as well. I didn't know him. Obviously, I knew Mark before. Jeff is 4 years younger than I am. But Mark and I reconnected at a George Clinton concert probably 10 years later when I was working with George, and we were at St. Andrews Hall, and he comes up to me, and I barely remember him, and he tells me who he is, and that's the night that we reconnected, George Clinton show down at St. Andrews Hall. And we both realized after talking that we had recording studios. He told me that he had a studio in his basement called Basement Sound. And I told him I had 54 Sound. And he said, you know, his number to the basement studios was 96 Sound. And I said, Mark, that's unbelievable. My number is 54 Sound. That was the exchange at the time, my studio, of course, being 54 Sound. Well, I found out from Mark that he originally tried to get that number, and it was somebody else's studio. He didn't know it was mine. So we reconnected when he was 18 and I was 28, and at that point started working together. Then I met his brother. Jeff, by then he had a reputation. He'd been signed to a Quincy Jones label called Quest, and had a group that he was the guitar player and writer in called Dream Boy. And Dream Boy was kind of a success story back then because they got signed to a major record deal. And, with me being in the business, it was one of the things that I was aware of. But I'd never met Jeff until I started working with him when he was working with his brother down in the basement.
And so let's fast forward to the mid-1990s now. Are you in partnership with Jeff and with Mark Bass in the mid-90s before Eminem comes into the picture?
I'm not sure if you'd call it a partnership before 1995. I mean, we were both working at each other's studios. We were looking for talent together. But generally speaking, I always had my own production company. And I don't think they'd started their own production company until I formally connected with them back in 1995. They were trying to sign groups like I was. And, I'd had a decent track record. I had 6 or 7 groups by that time that I'd signed and produced that were at least on major record labels. So they branched out into production, and in 1995, I agreed to kind of partner up with them. It was the first time I'd done that with anybody, and we put together what's known as FBT Productions, and signed our first group.
And so let's talk, 'cause I think this is what a lot of people will be really interested in. Let's talk about the discovery of Marshall, of Eminem. Who discovered, Eminem? Who first heard him and brought him to your attention? Tell us how that happened.
So before we partnered up officially in 1995, Mark had been working in his studio, again, the basement, with a lot of different groups. Some solo acts, a couple of bands, and he was working on other people's productions at that point. And I want to say it was 1992. I remember him telling me about this group that he heard on the radio on, I think it was WDRQ. It was a radio station back at the time that was just getting into hip hop, and he told me about this group called Soul Intent that he'd heard on the Lisa show, and he called her at some point while she was on the air with Soul Intent, and 3 guys, one of course being Marshall, were in this group, Soul Intent, and they had cassettes that they probably put together themselves that they were playing on the air, and then did some type of a live performance. And Mark didn't know anything about them, but called her, Lisa, because he knew her, and said, who are these guys? And Lisa put Marshall on the phone with Mark, and 3:00 that morning, Marshall and the group show up at Mark's basement at the house. And that's the first time they connected. And I believe, like I said, I think that goes back to 1992. But it was that radio show, apparently, that he'd first heard Marshall. And they connected. And Marshall shows up at his house. And they start this kind of relationship. I'd only heard about this. I'd never met Marshall back then in 92. But...
and how old was Marshall at that time?
I want to say Marshall was 16 or 17. And this is before Infinite. This is before they really did any recording together. But my recollection is that Marshall came into the studio, into Mark's studio, and they started recording. Maybe Marshall was actually paying for his own recording time, $10 an hour or whatever it was. Mark was just charging him the minimal to go down into this 8-track studio that they had in the basement. And I know that Marshall and Butter and a couple of the other guys were recording in the basement back then. And remember, this was like 1992, maybe 1993, and Mark's telling me about this kid Marshall, that he's telling me this guy's amazing. He's really wants to record him. He wants to do something with him. And I remember Mark telling me, and I'd never realized that Marshall was white. I thought that Mark was working with a group of kids that were, from the city, that were definitely black, and I had no idea he was working with a white rapper, so to speak, which back then was kind of like the kiss of death. They had Vanilla Ice was out there and being creamed at that time, and I just personally didn't think it was a good idea, because white rappers were certainly not being taken very seriously in the hip hop community, as I remember it back then. And all the guys in Soul Intent were kind of the same paint job. So I just didn't think it was a good bet. And I'd heard the material that they were working on, and it was okay. I wasn't terribly impressed, but for 2 years, Mark Bass is telling me that something's happening here, that he wants to record this kid, that there's something there. He knows it. It doesn't matter if he's white. People will accept it. And I thought he was crazy. I was working on 3 or 4 other things at the time that I thought we might at least get a record deal with. And, at some point, we decide, including Jeff, to start a production company. And again, that was FBT. And there were 2 projects that they wanted to sign. The first was a group called Liquid Paper. And Liquid Paper consisted of 3 members, one of whom, a guy named Michael Wilder, was Mark's engineer. And Michael Wilder started engineering with Marshall, and what became actually at some point D12, the first record that they were going to end up releasing, which was called Infinite. So this is back in 1995. I set up this production company, FBT Productions, and we signed both Liquid Paper, that was the first group, and Eminem.
Was Marshall Eminem at that time?
He was. Yeah, he was known as Eminem professionally, so to speak, and they record an album. At least Mike Wilder does. Mark and Jeff at that point did not have very much input into what Marshall was doing back then. It was kind of like, I think that Mike Wilder and Proof and Denine, all the people that were working with Marshall at that time kind of made some really rudimentary recordings that definitely showcased a young Marshall, but in terms of the music and in terms of production, it certainly wasn't, even for that time, very sophisticated. And I think that I want to say back in 1996, I believe that's when the album was actually released.
Infinite is the name of the album, Infinite?
Yeah, it was Infinite. That's the name of the record that was released in 1996. And I think we pressed up about 250 copies of vinyl and 250 copies of the cassette. And like I said, Mark and Jeff didn't have much to do with the project other than at that point being executive producers. They hadn't actually started working with Marshall musically back then. I believe, again, that it was, Marshall and some of the other group members of D12 and again, Mike Wilder that had put this first set of recordings together. I remember they did the whole thing on 2-inch tape, and 8 tracks were only used for each song. So they used 8 tracks for 4 songs on the same tape, the second 8 track for the next 4 songs, and the third 8 tracks on the same 2-inch tape for the next 4 songs, which was very unusual. So it was basically an 8-track recording. And it was released back in 1996, and it was a disaster. I mean, nobody got any traction with it. Like I said, we released 250 pieces of vinyl, 250 cassettes, and I think FBT only ended up selling 30 copies. And so the rest of the product was kind of given away. Marshall gave it away from the trunk of his car. He basically passed it out all over, going down to the hip-hop shop. Anybody that would listen to this, again, early version of Marshall didn't really seem to resonate. And it was devastating for Marshall. He, I think at some point, went back and rethought this whole approach and comes back with a tattoo on his arm 3 or 4 months later, and it's got Slim Shady written on his arm. It's like, well, what is Slim Shady? That's who he is. That's his alter ego. And from that point on, he started recording as his alter ego, Slim Shady. Again, I want to say it's 1997 because there was no traction on the Infinite record. It was very, very difficult to get, especially Jeff at that point, focused on working with Marshall. And I think Paul Rosenberg at that point, who's now Marshall's manager, came into the picture at first as Marshall's friend and or acquaintance, and then was going to law school at that time at the University of Detroit, and really pushed the idea of doing another recording, but this time with Mark and Jeff at the helm, where they did most of the music. And that's how the Slim Shady EP was born. But it was the first time that Mark and Jeff had really practically gotten into the studio and worked with Marshall and developed with him this kind of signature sound that he started becoming known for. Even back in 1997, something happened, and all of a sudden, we were selling 500 records, 1,000 records, 2,000 records, 2,000 CDs. Something was resonating with this recording, and Mark was going all over the place promoting this with Marshall, and it felt like, something was happening. I'd never, even back then, I don't remember ever manufacturing and selling 10,000 pieces of anything. That was a job of a major record company, but, to sell 10,000 pieces on the Slim Shady EP, people were starting to really take notice and listen. And it surprised me. I thought, hey, you know what? Maybe there's a record deal here. Maybe we could actually get a record deal. And I was really starting to believe that at that point we were on to something.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. I have one question, and then I want to ask you about Jimmy Iovine and Interscope and Aftermath and Dr. Dre and their entry into the picture. But before I do, because this is a question I've always thought to ask you, and I don't think I ever have. Was there a noticeable difference in Marshall's style of performing music when he first was Eminem versus this new alter ego Slim Shady? I mean, was there? He said, "Now I'm Slim Shady. That's who I am," and all of a sudden things took off. Was there a difference in his personal style?
Oh yeah. Marshall at that point didn't have anything to lose. It wasn't even sure that we were going to go in and record another album or EP because of the failure, basically, of the Infinite record. And he was just one pissed off kid that really did change his style and develop this alter ego where he went for broke. It was like he said it, as soon as he stopped giving a fuck about anything and how he was presenting himself, then people started paying attention because he was one pissed off young kid back then, making no money, still working as a cook, still living in really fucked up circumstances. And, I'd say that that change was really profound musically. And then getting together with Merck and Jeff and then helping him musically come up with the soundtrack to really what became the story of Marshall's life. Those recordings were brutal, and back then musically to be able to kind of accompany that properly. Remember back then a lot of people were sampling, a lot of people were using material that had been done by others and putting together. For the first time, Marshall was working with, I think, musicians that really knew how to put together tracks that complemented what he was doing that weren't samples. And one of the first things that Merck and Jeff did was they created original music that felt certainly like it was in some ways sample-like, but it was all original. And the samples that they did use originally, they became interpolated or they were taken off the record. And so that was really unusual because most rappers, most hip-hop artists were using heavily sampled material back then. So something definitely changed. And that's when people started noticing him. And I never understood it. This was just at the start of the internet, being able to kind of tell you who kids were listening to and what they were doing. And it really became one of the first viral things for us to be able to see where we could somehow, with a kid that had just released an EP, start selling 10,000 units of this EP, which was just, again, back then it was unheard of. So yes, it was profound, and I don't quite know how to explain it, but it's just one of those kinds of things that happen, and you'll never put your finger exactly on why it resonated, but it definitely hit a nerve.
Okay, let me ask you this, turning now to what you said a moment ago, which was that you started thinking that you could get a major record label, record deal for Marshall. As a production company, here you are, you have lightning in a bottle, so to speak, something that might come around once in a lifetime. Why would you and the Bass Brothers, as the team that signed him, that has him under contract, why would it be desirable to have a major record label involved who might end up interfering with that relationship? I'm just curious why that's something that you would want to have happen.
Well, first of all, the record deal at that point was really the only option. I mean, the measure of success back then as a production company was that you were able to bring an artist to the point where a record label was interested, and then they sign you through the label, and they sign the artist through the label. The artist would continue to record for the production company until something went south. But generally speaking, there was no way to get a real recording budget unless you were with a major label back at that point. And not to mention the fact that, it's one thing selling 10,000 records. But yeah, on the basis of that and the strength of what was going on in the street at that time, it was a perfect time for us to get a record deal. And lightning in a bottle, shit, I mean, there was no lightning. It was like we had somebody that we thought we'd get a record deal with. Nobody realized there was lightning in any bottle. It was just, you know what, we're going to get a record deal. There's 2 or 3 people interested. And I think we're actually going to get a major label involved here and then see what happens. But you think that any of us knew back then that it was lightning in a bottle, that's just crazy. Marshall did. Nobody did. It's impossible. The closest person to really believing blindly like that something was there was Mark Bass. He was kind of like a savant. You know, he was somewhat of a seer in a way that still perplexes me. But he knew that Marshall, being a white rapper with his abilities, did not have to go into the Vanilla Ice mold, and that there was a chance that he might be taken seriously.
How did you all then connect with Jimmy Iovine at Interscope and Dr. Dre at Aftermath Records?
Marshall and Mark and a couple of other people back at that time, they basically took a cross-country trip to head out to something called the Rap Olympics. I think they were in, they originally went to Las Vegas. I think Wendy Day had something to do with the routing where they were doing a series of shows on their way out to LA. And it actually happened quite quickly in retrospect, but Marshall at the Rap Olympics actually came in second and lost to somebody that probably did not deserve to win, and I think the crowd was pissed off, and I think Marshall probably broke down. And at that concert, or at that Rap Olympics, were a couple of different people that had either worked for Interscope. I remember in particular hearing about Evan Bogart, whose dad was Neil Bogart from Casablanca. And Mark, I remember telling me that he had given Evan a tape and that he was meeting all these people. And yes, Marshall lost, but it looks like, you know, they're going to start taking some meetings. And I believe it was Evan Bogart that somehow got the tape into Jimmy's office. And maybe it made its way from Jimmy's office to Dre at some point. I'm not exactly sure how accurate the story is, but remember, there was enough buzz about Marshall at that point to really get anybody interested at that level. What was so surprising was how quickly they moved. I mean, from the time Dre got the tape to when it became apparent that there was an actual record deal in place, I want to say it was like 3 weeks or 4 weeks. I'd never seen anything move so fast in my life. So it was that quick. And it was really before anybody had a chance to step up, and there was no bidding war. There were people that were interested, but they sniped it and probably saw something that all of us didn't, although I don't know how somebody can be that smart. Well, Jimmy Iovine's a pretty fucking smart guy. And, of course, you know, Dre's credibility and the idea that they worked together under the Aftermath label as opposed to just signing with Interscope was brilliant. And it was, you know, a story that is still to me kind of unbelievable because on top of getting a record deal, they released the first single, and within 6 months to the release of the album, the first week, they had sold close to 300,000 copies of the album in the first week. That was the lightning in the bottle that you could see and feel and touch at that point. But 2 months earlier, bullshit. Nobody would have known that. I don't care who they were. Maybe they had good hunches. Maybe they were onto something. But to know that it was going to break through at that level, and basically they took a lot of the material from that EP that Mark and Jeff had recorded, brought Dr. Dre in, and he did 2 or 3 tracks. And they end up selling 5 million units on the Slim Shady LP.
Amazing. And Mark and Jeff at this time were doing all the music for Marshall?
Oh, almost all the music. You know, again, back then in the beginning, the record was pretty much done because they took most of the Slim Shady EP and other songs that they had. And because Dre was brought in so late, I think he had only had a chance. Well, he did My Name Is, you know, the first single. Actually, it was the second single. The first single was Mark and Jeff's Just Don't Give a Fuck. That was the first single and video. But the breakthrough single was My Name Is. and it was a sample. And of course, Dre was heavily working with samples back then. And I think of all the tracks Mark and Jeff did, there might have been one sample that we had, or I cleared at that point. I think it was a Curtis Mayfield sample, but all the material that they delivered was essentially sample-free, which at that point was unheard of. Now, as a production company, I'm sure the record company thinks, these kids are going to get fucked up. They're going to deliver a record. There's going to be a bunch of claims. And at that point, the only claims for samples and infringements were for the music that Dr. Dre produced, in part because it was the same issue. They'd never bothered to clear anything and didn't pay very much attention. And that's how rappers never got paid. That's how there's a whole generation of rappers out there, and you should know this, Richard, because you brought half of the lawsuits. The sample infringement cases in the 90s and 2000s became the hallmark of that era as it relates to artists not getting paid, and in some cases owing money after they have a hit record because they didn't clear or they took material that they didn't bother to interpolate and to sample and get permissions for. But because of my relationship going back to the George Clinton days and me working for Westbound Records, I understood what was going on in terms of sampling and basically instilled this in Mark and Jeff that we can't have any samples on the record unless they were cleared, or better yet, why don't you just go create some original music and see what it feels like. So that album was essentially the first album, the first major hip-hop record that was a smash that was pretty much sample-free, with the exception of Dre's tracks.
And, I mean, just Mark and Jeff wrote and are behind the music from the iconic song "Lose Yourself." That intro and the entire music is Mark and Jeff.
Well, that was really, I would say at that point it was Jeff and Louie and Marshall. But by the time "Lose Yourself" came around, it was much more. The process had kind of changed with respect to how Marshall was working. He ends up coming back to Detroit. We built the studio. I built the second part of 54 Sound. And he's working with not just Jeff Bass, but Louis Rusto and Steve King. And they're recording where Marshall's taking more of control of the production as it relates to direction. They were still recording original music as opposed to sampling, but Dre's production input increased. I think Dre, for the second record, which was a Marshall Mathers LP, had probably produced half the record, and then Bass Brothers produced the other half of the record. But by the time "Lose Yourself" came around, I think Marshall was really, in terms of direction, very specific in terms of how and what he was choosing to use from all the musicians he was working with, including Dre, but definitely including Mark and Jeff and Louie. So yes, the guitar, the music portion was written by Jeff and Louie, and it was written during the course of the time that they were filming the 8 Mile movie. So I think that their musical styles had pretty much solidified by then with respect to, working on original material, but Marshall was way more sophisticated by the time it came to making that record, "Lose Yourself."
So I want to talk now, shift gears and talk about some of the litigation and lawsuits that you and I have been involved with together. But before I do, am I correct that when, through a couple of different agreements with Interscope, first when you furnished the services of Eminem to Aftermath and Interscope, and then some other agreements, FBT had a right to and has a right to a certain percentage of royalties from the sales of Eminem records?
Yeah, from the beginning, we had a relationship where, as a production company, we signed Marshall and basically furnished his services to Interscope or to Aftermath Interscope. And we were the production company that was given approval to be able to continue producing his records as long as Marshall was happy with the arrangement. And, most people get into these production deals, most artists, and it doesn't go very well for the production company at some point. Usually the record company brings in another producer and people have their own people working, with the artist, and the production company is really marginalized. And the danger of furnishing an artist through a production company for the production company is that, if you lose your relationship with the artist can always go directly to the label and start recording for the label, because it's very easy for the label to put the production company in breach by saying that they're not delivering the recordings or the artist doesn't want to work with them anymore. But miraculously, the relationship went so well up until the second and third record that there was no situation where the record company was stepping in the middle of it. Maybe they wanted to, but things were going so well at that point, and Marshall was continuing to make records with FBT, and under the guidance of Mark and Jeff and Louie and Dre, that there was never a reason for the record company to want to remove the production company from the equation. Things were going too well. But at some point, they said, look, how about if we do this? Everything seems right, but we'd like to have Marshall have a direct relationship with Interscope. Why don't we do this? We'll give you the right to continue to produce and be involved from a royalty standpoint. And for as long as Marshall wants to work with you guys, you're good. And if he doesn't want to work with you guys for a period of albums, we're going to give you an override. And by the way, we'll also give you audit rights. We'll give you the right to be able to audit. We'll give you the right to be able to participate, just like Marshall does, and be kind of like the gatekeepers in terms of making sure that we could do audits on behalf of Marshall and vice versa, and that we both had the same types of rights going forward into the future. So we entered into something called a novation, where basically it segregated the rights that we had so that Marshall had his own direct relationship with the record company, but so did we as well, so that we could do things, for example, like examine the books. We could make decisions as it related to licensing, because we in fact had administrative rights with respect to the publishing, and we could decide whether or not a deal was good for Marshall and for the other writers, or if it was bad, make sure that things were arm's length. And it gave us the right to basically stay on top of all the provisions of the recording agreement as if we were still in place.
Was that important to you, to be able to have those rights?
Turns out to be the most important aspect of the recording agreement that survives today, because, as you know, Richard, the ability for the record company to interpret their own agreements in their favor is obvious. It's been going on for years, but I don't think anybody could have predicted the change in the record business as it relates to digital, and how important that was in terms of how people were or weren't getting paid on, as you know, whether it's called a record sale or a license. There are two different things in recording or contracts that really make a huge difference in terms of how an artist and the participants are seeing income.
So that's a perfect segue into one of our most famous lawsuits that we did together. I met you through Armin and Bridgeport and Westbound in that rap litigation that you mentioned. I remember meeting you for the first time at a Wendy's restaurant in Detroit. It was you pulled up in an old pickup truck, and never in a billion years would I have guessed that you were the person who you are. but
Richard, it was
you were
a classic pickup truck. It was not an old. Don't play that bullshit. You know what I was driving to.
I do know. And I'm going to talk about another situation we had in one of your cars in a minute.
Right,
But
right.
so we met, and then, Armin kind of recommended that you hire me, and we ended up filing the litigation that I've mentioned earlier in this podcast, which is now world famous and landmark litigation, number one, that ultimately determined that the agreements between the record labels and iTunes were license agreements, not sale agreements, and that M&M and FBT were entitled to 50% of the label's net receipts rather than the much lower record sale provision in the contract. I guess and you were the one that had the courage to file this. We know that there was complaints by others. There's a famous letter that was written by a lot of entertainment lawyers to the labels when iTunes launched, saying that the license provision should apply. But no one had the courage to actually file the lawsuit or to pursue it. So, what gave you the courage and the demand to actually see this thing and file the lawsuit despite the controversy that was involved? Because obviously, to be alienating the record label by bringing this up. So, why did you feel it was important to do it?
Back then, because of the number of records that we were selling, and remember, by this time, I want to say it's 2007, we'd sold like physical product close to 25 million records, maybe 30 million records between the first Interscope record, which was a Slim Shady LP, and then Marshall Mathers LP, which sold, I think that sold probably 20 million records, physical records around the world alone. So maybe it was 35 million at that point. It was just numbers. Once we realized that they were taking the position from an audit that we conducted, and I want to say it goes back to 2007 when we finally realized what was happening, that the record company was taking the position that the digital downloads that were happening through iTunes, essentially, or the iTunes store. Remember, they referred to it as a store back then. The digital downloads really were basically record sales through normal retail channels, which means that they could apply things like breakage, they could apply things like packaging, they could apply things that really had nothing to do with a digital file and apply it as if they could take all these deductions and come up with a rate that was meant to be specific to a single, as if you would release a 45 or a piece of product that you had to manufacture and had all these costs inherent and built into. And so, for example, on a best case scenario for us, if there was a 99-cent download and they applied the sales provision to the royalty rate on a 99-cent download, it might mean that we collectively, meaning Marshall and FBT, are receiving 12 to 14 cents net out of that 99-cent sale. Now, we had a pretty decent royalty rate for physical at that time. Just think about this. Of all the artists, all the Motown artists, all the artists that came before us that had royalty rates of 1, 2, 3, 4% based on record sales, if you do the math on a 99-cent download, that might mean that they're only getting 3 pennies out of 99 cents because they had a sales provision that built in the royalty rate for normal retail channels, and they tried to do everything that they could to convince everybody that the normal retail channel was now iTunes. What's the difference? It's a store. You go in, you buy it. Well, you didn't really buy it. You kind of licensed it, which was the whole issue really at stake. But whether it was a sale or a download was the crux of the math, that when you saw it in black and white, you realized, wait a second. The record companies and the digital providers like iTunes are taking 85, 90% of the money in most cases, and they don't have any expenses. Now, you could see why they might take 85 to 90% if it was a single, where it was costly to manufacture. They had packaging, they had artwork, they had breakage, they had overseas deductions because, back then it was expensive to export physical. And they took the position that this was all physical. It was the same thing. There was no difference. Maybe they were generous enough to give everybody an uplift out of the goods of their heart, and maybe give people another couple of pennies to just kind of pacify everybody. But, Richard, when you're selling 35 million records, how in the hell could we sit there and let that happen? If you do the math and multiply it, it's a difference between, just in 5 or 6 years, 50, 60, $70 million to our accounts, our net accounts, if they were allowed to take the position that all these record sales, so to speak, through iTunes were just that. They were record sales through normal channels. But there's a provision in most recording contracts that say if the record is licensed, meaning given to third parties, and they take care of all the costs, you don't incur any, frequently there's a 50-50 split provision. And economically, it made sense because the record company's got no costs. They're just passing it along to a third party. The third party can take a distribution fee, but they're in charge of manufacturing. They're in charge of all the costs. Well, Apple was taking, at that time, a 30% fee, right? That should be 70%. If you do the math on our end, after a couple of other deductions, the record company and the artist should be splitting 50-50 the proceeds. But, of course, they did not do that. They took the position that only a fraction of that was due to the artist. So how could I not take this into consideration in terms of making a claim? This is the kind of thing we were set up for. I worked for a record company and understood the mechanics of how royalties were being paid. I understood what they were trying to do, but when you sell that kind of product and eventually everything is going to digital, you can see where everything is going to end up. You're getting a fraction of typically what you should be getting because of the interpretation of one or two clauses that might conflict with each other.
So we end up filing the case, and Steve Jobs had done an essay called Thoughts on Music, where he admitted multiple times, a public essay, that the agreement between the record label and iTunes were license agreements, that they don't buy anything from the record labels. And at trial, the judge actually excluded that essay. Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember. Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
We obviously disagreed with that. You know that, in fact, and we've talked about this before, during jury selection, I'm going to throw this out there because I have to defend myself somewhat. Do you remember there was a Catholic priest that was in the jury pool? Do you remember that, Joel?
Yes, Richard, I do.
And do you remember me walking over to you during jury selection saying, Eminem is a very controversial person. He uses bad lyrics, sometimes bad words. We need to get this Catholic priest off the jury. And you insisted, because you thought the contract, and it was so clear, that he would be able to read it. He'd read scripture, and he would see exactly how clear this was in our favor, and we kept him on the jury. Do you remember that?
Well, I remember a little bit more than that. I remember thinking that because the priest had said that he was also a musician, I thought it was pretty credible that, maybe a priest that was also a musician could understand the importance of getting paid properly as a musician, and that we might have a good chance to convince him, as well as the other 11 jurors, that something's wrong with the math here, that this just doesn't add up, and it's really unjust enrichment for a record company to take the lion's share of royalties when they're not physically manufacturing and doing anything. So yes, I disagreed. We kept the priest on the jury. And come to find out later that, no pun intended, the priest fucked us.
Yeah, he did. He did not like Eminem. He was not a fan, and he controlled that jury room. And
that's what we found out afterwards.
Yes.
I mean, after talking to several jurors, and look, let's be honest, it was really a jury of lay people at that point. The issue was whether or not music was sold by way of a license or licensed by way of Apple.
Well, actually, a little bit different.
Through normal retail channels now.
A little bit different, really. I mean, that was kind of the argument of the defense, was that the end user buys the download, and we said that really wasn't even relevant, because the relevant transaction, of course, is the transaction between the record label and iTunes, and that agreement is a license, and since the record label, as you said a moment ago, has no cost, that whether it's downloaded one time or a billion times, that under the clear language of the license provision in the recording agreement, it's a license, and therefore we win. And we felt that was very clear, and it actually was very clear, and that's why we ended up winning in the Ninth Circuit.
To explain a license in terms of music, as opposed to a sale to a lay jury, was one of the most difficult things I've ever experienced in my life.
But that's why we filed our motion for summary judgment to begin with, because we told the judge in the motion for summary judgment, none of that matters. This idea that it's all their product and it's all the same music is irrelevant. What's relevant is what provision of the recording agreement governs the royalties that are paid for that same music, and there are several that govern different exploitations, and this is this. And obviously we ultimately won easily. The Ninth Circuit had no problem finding that what we said was right. But you're right, it's when you get in front of a jury like that and they lose sight of what the issue really is, and you have quite frankly, this Catholic priest who said he just did not like Eminem and he was going to go against us no matter what, and controlled this jury. Those are issues, and those are problems you have to deal with in the practice of law and in taking on these kind of cases.
Well, it would have helped if the judge would have made, based on your motion for summary judgment, a ruling that, as a matter of law, the contract said what it said, that there was no contradictions. If it was a license to a third-party company, it should fall under the licensing provision. Unfortunately, he came close, but not quite there. So what we had to do is go through the whole process of a trial where, at the end of the day, a jury decided, as a matter of law, what the contract meant, because there was no conflicting extrinsic evidence that would have allowed them to make that type of decision. It was all the language of the contract. And, of course, that's how you got it overturned when we lost, which, by the way, I remember you throwing up in the bathroom that day.
I did.
At the courthouse.
I did.
And I had lost as well. You remember, Richard, and I'm consoling you. And it was the worst day of my life. And we were both devastated to the point where it was so bleak back then. And
listen, let me tell you something, Joel. And bleak is not the word, because this is something that people might not know. So yes, we were both devastated by that decision. We thought it was just a complete miscarriage of justice. And you're right. It was horrible. This is what still amazes me to this day, which is that at the time, and I think under the contract, the prevailing party, whoever won on a breach of contract case, under your contract, got their attorney's fees. So not only did we lose at the district court trial level, you were faced with several $1 million in attorney's fees, having to pay the record label. And this litigation was occurring during the financial crisis. nobody was loaning money. Everyone was losing their shirt. And you could have settled this case, gone to Universal and said, okay, let's make a deal, and just maybe just walked away in exchange for them for giving you your attorney's fees. It would have been the easiest thing to do. It would have been the simplest thing to do. It would have been the safest thing to do. But instead of doing that, and I don't know where the strength comes from. I talked about, the gay family in my first podcast, staring down the barrel of a gun, literally, and taking the chance of litigating the case, the Blurred Lines case, when we had some terrible decisions leading up to the trial, and we were trying the case with one arm tied behind our back, but they went forward and did it. And you, just as amazingly, basically, leveraged what you had to post a bond to cover the attorney's fees in the middle of the financial crisis, literally doubling down on the case and risking everything by going to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. I mean, I'm amazed by that to this day. I'm incredibly thankful.
Well,
I'm incredibly,
Richard, if we didn't, the truth is that it was almost as if I didn't have an opportunity to do anything but, because it was so tough to me, and of course to everybody on our team at that point, for the jury to make an interpretation as a matter of law and to be able to interpret the contract. Something was just so wrong with that, because they're not set up to do that. Yes, you're right. The real problem at that point was that we were then ordered to pay Universal their legal fees, $2.4 million, into the case at this point. And we did not have that kind of money to be able to put up as it related to the bond. And this was coming at a very bad time. I want to say that, can't remember exactly that, but it was right in the middle of, maybe it was 2009, 2010. Remember how crazy the markets were? It was impossible to be able to borrow money. Well, I had investments, normal investments through the banking system and through a brokerage firm. And I had my recording studio. I had our contract that we were still receiving royalties through, even though that was probably going to be suspended. But I had what I considered to be pretty good assets. Went to the bank to ask for the $2.4 million in a bond, and they told me that they would only lend me 70% of the money that I had in my prime investment account. They said that they would only credit 70% in these supposed top grade investments, and they would give me nothing for the futures in our contract as security. They would give me nothing for the real estate that I owned. They would give me nothing for my recording studios, any of the intellectual properties. They did not want to hear it. They were lending money to nobody. And here I thought, I've had a relationship with my bank for 25 years. We were finished. Unless we posted a bond for the $2.4 million, we were not going to be able to go ahead and appeal this. So I remember at that point, yes, I did double down. I sold most of my investment grade assets at a loss and scraped together whatever we had, including borrowing money from different people, just to be able to post this bond of $2.4 million. And I don't know if I would ever do it again, but at that time, we were so outraged by the idea that the jury could interpret a legal matter and interpret a contract, that after talking to a couple of great top appellate law firms that you arranged, we felt good that our chances were reasonable that we would at least get the decision overturned and go back for a new trial.
One of my favorite stories of all time is, I mean, there's several, and I'm going to mention a few of them before we finish today. But one of my absolute favorite stories is that during this process, you end up arranging a meeting at Universal after the jury trial, but then before the appeal gets really going. You arrange for a meeting and you go meet with a couple of the senior executives at Universal to see if it can be resolved. Of course, you still want an increase in your royalties. You want them to forgive any attorney's fees. You're not giving up. You're basically sticking with your initial demands. And one of the executives turned to the other and said, he really thinks he's going to win. Is that what happened?
Yeah, he really believes this. So for me to come in and suggest that maybe we somehow settle this, they wipe out the $2.4 million that we owed them, and they give us a couple of pennies increase on the digital royalty rate, thought it was absurd, and they wouldn't hear it.
And we won.
Well, it was an extraordinary turn of events, Richard. You remember what happened.
Well, of course. We filed the appeal, and we are waiting for, nearly a year or so, I think, for the decision. I'll never forget where I was when it comes across my email, but the Court of Appeals rules that as a matter of law, like we asked the district court to rule a couple of times, that the agreement between Universal and Apple was a license agreement, clear, unambiguous, and that the language in your licensing agreement, and I think I still have it memorized, on masters licensed by us to others for the manufacture and distribution of records or for any other uses, your royalty.
That was the key. For any other uses.
Your royalty shall be 50%. And the court ruled as a matter of law that was clear, unambiguous. These were licenses, and we win. And it was an amazing, probably one of the happiest days of my life.
Well, listen, Richard, between you and the appellate attorneys, Jerry Falk and Dan Asimo, the ability to be able to overturn this and get the Ninth Circuit to see, in fact, that this was just crazy logic, to have the jury basically interpret as a matter of law a provision was just so wrong. But, at that point, who knew what was really going to happen, that this would not only be overturned, but that as a matter of law, the contract should be interpreted unambiguously that these were licensed transactions and they weren't normal sales transactions. And so, look, it for us, of course, it turned everything around. We ended up winning as it related to that decision, but at that point, a lot of other people were in line to take a look at their contracts and see what kinds of provisions they had that talked about licensing versus sales. And as you know, it opened up a whole forefront legally as it relates to the digital age and how people are paid.
It did. And I've talked about that a little bit. I handled many, many other cases just like this one for a lot of different artists, and there were class actions and all that. But I did want to back up for 1 second and mention something else that's amazing to me to this day. At the very same time, this is another lawsuit that you brought. At the very same time that we had lost at the district court level on this digital download royalty case, we were pursuing Apple Music on another matter relating to the use of the Eminem compositions. And despite the hole you were in, you refused to give up in that case as well. And we actually began a trial in that case during the pendency of the appeal. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So we sued Apple for copyright infringement. And I remember we made a really good argument in that case that I think scared the hell out of Apple. We argued that in a copyright infringement case, that the defendant is liable for the profits attributable to the infringement. And at that time, Eminem had a huge percentage of all the downloads on Apple. And we made the argument that the iTunes store was basically a loss leader, that they didn't make money off of, allowing downloads. They made their money on iPod sales, because
That's right.
that's when iPods were, the main method of distributing the Apple Music, not, iPhones. We were talking about 2006 to 2008 or 9. And we said that we were entitled to the same percentage of the Eminem downloads on iTunes versus the entire, catalog of iTunes music as it related to iPods, the same percentage of iPod sales, which could have been in
to profits.
Yeah, exactly.
To profits. And remember the day in court when the judge we were halfway through, maybe three-quarters of the way through the trial, and she got pissed off at something and then allowed profits to be fair game.
Well, it wasn't just profits. It was the profits from iPod sales that were a percentage of the overall iPod sales, just as the Eminem downloads were the same percentage of overall downloads on iTunes. And the judge ruled in the middle of the trial that that theory was viable and potentially valid, and that was a real turning point in the trial.
She allowed it in court, and then all of a sudden, 3 or 4 people in the back, lawyers from Apple, stood up and intervened, and
that's when we settled.
Broke loose.
Well, that's when we settled the case after the judge
exactly.
refused.
That's when we settled the case. But when profits became up for grabs as it relates to market share, and of course, Marshall was extremely important in terms of market share. It still is, obviously, but at that point, oh my God, they were selling so many iPods, they were making so much money. Can you imagine what their profits would have looked like in the success of iPods if they were missing Marshall and Tupac and half the other artists at that time that were making up huge market share for them? It would have been a disaster to get into profits.
Let me tell you let me tell you what my favorite story is from that litigation. But it's one of my favorite stories of all time, actually. You and I, heading. What morning we have court? I believe it was the first day of trial, and we're up against Apple, this multi-billion-dollar, $100 billion market cap company. Maybe now it's $1 trillion. Who knows what it was back then? Maybe several $100 billion, up against a whole team of lawyers. You pick me up in this I don't know what year the car is.
1964.
1964
Falcon Futura
convertible. It's snowing because it's the winter time. It's snowing. There's sleet. And as we start driving, number one, the top of your convertible hood opens up and we can't get it to close. So I am holding the top of the convertible hood as best I can. And then your car stalls at a red light with your car starting, and I am holding the latch to your convertible roof, which is flying up, and snow and ice is coming into the car. I looked at you and I said, can you imagine if the lawyers from Apple, who probably flew in on a private jet, saw us at this very moment? This looks like, Abbott and Costello go to court. It could be a movie, Abbott and Costello go to court. And we were laughing hysterically. One of the great memories of my life.
I know, that's right, at I-75 and 9 Mile. It wasn't our finest moment, Richard. You tried the latch on the hood broke for some reason on the convertible.
Because it's a 1964 car.
The car stalls. We're right next to a gas station. We're on our way down to court, federal court in Detroit, and That's the kind of ship you're running.
That's the kind of ship you're running.
Listen, I got to tell you something. You know, if it was the idea that we at some point could be in that position after losing a major lawsuit and doubling down on just the Apple litigation and being in that position back in, I want to say it's 2010 or 2011. I never want to do that again, Richard. Ever. Don't you ever put me through that again. But part of the reason I doubled down was because, you know, I don't know how many people know this, but the worst thing somebody could do, a smart lawyer, is to underestimate your determination, not only to win, but your fear of losing. Because you, in part, are such an amazing lawyer, because maybe not because you're smarter than the rest, but you have such a fear that you are not going to win this lawsuit and you're going to potentially lose it, that you do backflips and do anything that's necessary to stay on top of your case and treat it as if this is the last thing in the world that you've got to worry about. And listen, I'd be in a car with you holding the convertible top down any day, anytime, because that's the kind of lawyer you are.
Well, I love you, man, for saying that. I really do. One of my favorite, that's one of my favorite stories, the convertible story. The other one is you actually, and I think I'll end this interview on this, because this is just one of the greatest lines I've ever heard in my life, and I tell people this all the time. We sued Facebook because they used an Eminem song as part of some introduction, something on the internet when they were introducing some type of new event or program or something. And you were being deposed by Facebook's lawyer, and we were making a demand for, based on Eminem's popularity and what he should have received, what you should have received for as a license. And I remember the lawyer saying, "You're not suggesting, are you, that Eminem is like as popular as Elvis Presley, are you?" And I never forget what you said. You looked at him and you said, "You can make that comparison if you want to, but of course Eminem has sold more records." That was the greatest comeback line I have ever heard, I got to tell you. So good.
She was at a disadvantage. It was an older attorney that really didn't quite know what was happening. And yes, of course, Marshall is, as it relates to record sales, way bigger than Elvis Presley. And it's putting it mildly.
Yep. Thanks. This has been incredible. I've had you on the phone now for about an hour and 40 minutes. It's amazing. Thank you very much. And I know, all jokes aside, that today has not been a great day for you. You told me that you learned today that a friend of yours in New York passed away from COVID-19 just today, which...
Yeah, really, really sad. He was the musical, he did all the musical interludes for the SNL show for the last 40 years. He was an extraordinary character in the music scene in New York, and he's going to be missed by so many people. But unfortunately, that's where we are right now, and I just hope I don't get any more bad news tomorrow. And we're on our way here to breaking through this vicious cycle of virus. Terrible.
I think it's going to be better, though. I think something's going to happen. I think they're going to, I just believe that we're going to get some good news, and we'll get through this, and hopefully sooner rather than later.
Yeah, well, hey, listen, Richard, at least you're not in court, right? You don't have to appear anywhere tomorrow or the next week, right?
Although I'm in quarantine and I would love to get out and do something, but getting to talk to you for like 2 hours has been amazing.
Yeah, well, we'll do a postscript on this, and I appreciate the time. Thank you,
All right.
Richard.
All right, love you, Joel.
Okay, bye-bye, you too.
So thank you all for listening to this second episode of Blurred Laws and Life with me, your host, Richard Busch. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed it. And for all of you in quarantine, as I mentioned, and if you need a good laugh, please watch Billy on the Street. As he says, he's making dreams come true. And I know that this nightmare for us will soon be over. See you next week.